Blood freezes faster than one might think. It turns tacky, then stiff, binding the fabric of tactical pants to the torn meat of a thigh. 15 men were hunting Cora, Spetsnaz, Alpha Group. They had thermal optics, fresh rations, and the arrogance of predators who had cornered a wounded animal. She had 3 magazines, a shattered sniper rifle, and a jagged piece of shrapnel embedded in her leg. They thought she was going to bleed out in the snow. They were wrong. Pain is not a sudden, sharp thing, not when it's this deep. It's a slow, grinding ache that radiates from the bone outward, humming in tune with the heartbeat. Cora dragged her body over the frost-heaved roots of a dead oak, the bark scraping raw against her freezing cheek. Her left leg dragged behind her like a sack of wet sand. Every time her knee caught on a rock, a wave of nausea washed over her, tasting intensely of old pennies and stomach acid. She dry-heaved into the snow, nothing coming up but strings of yellow bile. Walker was dead. She didn't feel sad about it yet. Sadness was a luxury for people sitting in warm living rooms. Right now, she just felt a simmering, irrational resentment toward him. He was supposed to watch the eastern ridge. He was supposed to call the wind. Instead, he took a 12.7mm round through the neck. The wet, tearing sound of it still echoed in her ears, louder than the wind howling through the skeletal birch trees. He had died instantly, slumping over his spotting scope, spraying hot arterial blood across her face. Then came the second shot, the one that hit the concrete pillar beside her, sending a jagged wedge of rebar through the meat of her outer thigh. Her custom-built bolt-action rifle, her lifeline, had been crushed under the collapsing debris. She had crawled out of the kill zone like a rat abandoning a flooded sewer. Now she was alone in a nameless Eastern European forest, bleeding out. The sky above was the color of bruised iron, pressing down on the canopy. It was -12 degrees. The cold was a physical weight, pressing into her lungs with every jagged breath. Cora fumbled with the tourniquet high on her thigh. Her fingers were stiff, the joints locking up, the skin mottled purple and white. She wrenched the windlass another half-turn. A scream caught in her throat, coming out as a pathetic, animal whimper. The pain was blinding, white-hot fire blooming beneath the frozen skin. She locked the plastic rod into the clip, her breathing erratic, fast and shallow. Control the heart rate, the academy instructors used to bark. Panic kills before the bullet does. She hated those instructors right now. She wanted to see them out here, choking on freezing mud, waiting for a squad of Russian elite operators to finish them off. A sound broke through the wind. Crunch, pause, crunch, footsteps, methodical, spaced out. They weren't rushing. They were tracking the blood trail she had left before getting the tourniquet secured. Drops of crimson on pristine white snow. A child could follow it. Cora pressed her back against the decaying stump of the oak. The wood was damp and smelled of rot and dormant fungi. She unholstered her sidearm, a standard issue, SIG P226. The metal frame was freezing, biting through her thin, tactical gloves. 15 rounds of 9mm against 15 heavily armored Spetsnaz operators, carrying assault rifles and wearing level 4 ceramic plates. She wasn't a hero. She didn't want to die for her country right now. She just wanted a hot shower and a cup of black coffee. The sheer, overwhelming urge to just close her eyes, to let the freezing lethargy take over, was terrifyingly seductive. It would be so easy. Just go to sleep. The cold would numb the pain. The Russians would put a bullet in her head, and she wouldn't even feel it. But spite is a powerful stimulant. Cora racked the slide of the pistol, the metallic clack shockingly loud in the quiet forest. She checked the chamber, one in the pipe. She looked at her shaking hands. Dirt was jammed under her fingernails. Walker's dried blood was flaking off her knuckles. "Okay," she whispered, her voice raspy, barely audible over the wind. "Okay, come get it." She wasn't going to fight them like a seal. Seals used overwhelming firepower, precise communication, and air support. She had none of those. She was going to have to fight them like a cornered wolverine. Dirty, panicked, vicious, she gathered a handful of loose snow and rubbed it over her face, wiping away the dark streaks of blood that would stand out against the white landscape. She packed snow over her wound, burying the black nylon of the tourniquet, hoping the freezing temperature would obscure her thermal signature, at least a little. The footsteps were closer now, less than 50 yards. She closed her eyes, focusing entirely on her hearing. The rustle of nylon fabric, the faint, high-pitched whine of active noise-cancelling headsets. There were two of them, a vanguard, moving in a loose wedge formation, sweeping the trees. Cora pushed herself flat into the shallow depression beneath the oak roots, letting the falling snow begin to cover her. She slowed her breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. The hunt had started. The point man appeared through the tree line like a ghost. He was entirely clad in over-white winter camouflage, his rifle wrapped in white tape, his face obscured by a balaclava and tactical goggles. He moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a man who had spent his life walking through hostile territory. He wasn't looking down at the tracks anymore. He was looking ahead. He knew she was close. Cora lay motionless beneath a dusting of snow and rotting leaves, her body wedged into the frozen mud. Her leg throbbed with a sickening rhythm, but the cold was finally doing its job, numbing the surface nerves. 10 yards, she could smell him. The sharp, chemical scent of gun oil, the stale odor of wet wool, and the faint, unexpected sweetness of spearmint gum. It was such an aggressively normal smell that it almost broke her concentration. This was a man, with breath and habits and a heartbeat. 5 yards. He paused, raising his fist to signal the man behind him. The second operator stopped 20 yards back, covering his sector. The point man took a step toward the dead oak. He was looking directly at the roots where she lay. His rifle barrel, capped with a thick suppressor, swept in her direction. If she shot him with the pistol, the crack of the 9mm would echo for miles. The entire squad would converge on her in seconds. She would get 1, maybe 2, before they turned her into Swiss cheese. She didn't use the gun. As the operator stepped over the root, bringing his boot inches from her face, Cora exploded upward from the snow. It wasn't a clean, cinematic strike. Her wounded leg gave out immediately, turning her lunge into a desperate, falling tackle. She crashed into his knees, sending them both tumbling into the freezing muck. The Russian grunted in surprise, his finger tightening on the trigger. His rifle spat 3 suppressed rounds into the dirt, kicking up chunks of frozen shale. Cora scrambled up his body like a feral cat. He was massive, his armor plating, feeling like a brick wall beneath her chest. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang on its sling, and reached for her throat with thick, gloved hands. His grip was like a vice, crushing her windpipe. She didn't try to pry his hands away. She knew she couldn't outmuscle him. Instead, she drew the fixed-blade combat knife from her chest rig. She drove the blade downward, aiming for the soft gap between his plate carrier and his collarbone. Her frozen fingers slipped. The knife deflected off his ceramic plate with a sickening scrape, slicing shallowly across his shoulder. The Russian snarled, a guttural sound of pure adrenaline, and rolled, pinning her beneath him. The impact drove the air from her lungs. Her wounded leg screamed in agony as it was twisted under his weight. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. He drew his own knife, a wicked, curved blade, and raised it high. She was dead, a cynical voice whispered in her head. All that training, and she was going to die in a puddle of mud. She didn't think. She reacted. Cora spit a mouthful of bloody saliva directly into his goggles. It was a pathetic, juvenile move, but it worked. For a fraction of a second, the operator flinched, blinking against the red smear on his lens. Cora bucked her hips, driving her knee into his groin, and shoved her blade upward with both hands, using the last ounce of strength in her core. The knife slid under his jaw, bypassing the heavy fabric of his balaclava, and sank deep into the soft tissue of his throat. The Russian stiffened. His eyes went wide behind the smeared goggles. The knife fell from his hand, plunging harmlessly into the mud next to her ear. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a wet, gurgling hiss came out. Hot blood poured from the wound, washing over Cora's hands, soaking through her gloves. It was shockingly warm against the freezing air. He thrashed wildly, his hands tearing at her uniform, fighting the inevitable. Cora held on, pressing her face against his chest, riding out the violent spasms of a dying man. She smelled the iron of his blood mixing with the spearmint gum. She felt the exact moment his heart stopped fighting, the heavy, dead weight of him collapsing entirely onto her. She shoved his corpse off her, gasping for air, her chest heaving. 14, she thought. There was no time to rest. The second man would have heard the scuffle. Cora stripped the dead point man with frantic efficiency. She didn't want his heavy plate carrier. It would only slow her down. But she took his weapon, an AK-12, suppressed, with an optic sight. She ripped 3 spare magazines from his chest rig and shoved them into her dump pouch. She found a fragmentation grenade and a handheld radio. She grabbed the radio just as a voice crackled through it in clipped, urgent Russian. She didn't speak the language fluently, but she recognized an inquiry when she heard one. The second man was checking in. He wanted to know what the noise was. Cora dropped the radio into the snow and crushed it beneath her boot. She gripped the captured rifle. The polymer stock felt foreign, the balance completely different from her customized gear, but it was a weapon. It leveled the playing field, just a fraction. She looked at the blood soaking her hands, her own blood from her leg, Walker's blood from the sniper hide, and now the Russian's blood. She was painted in it. She limped away from the body, moving deeper into the timber, her bad leg dragging, leaving a trail she knew they would find. Let them. The dynamic had shifted. She was still bleeding, she was still dying, but she wasn't just prey anymore. The adrenaline crash hit her 20 minutes later. It felt like walking into a concrete wall. Her vision blurred, swimming with grey static. Her hands shook so violently she could barely keep her finger off the trigger of the captured AK-12. The cold, which had been pushed back by the violent struggle, returned with a vengeance, seeping into her marrow. Cora leaned against the rusted husk of an abandoned logging tractor. The metal was frozen, shedding flakes of orange rust onto the snow. She was standing at the edge of an old, derelict logging camp. Half-collapsed wooden sheds, overgrown with skeletal vines, dotted the clearing. Piles of rotting timber lay like bleached bones under the grey sky. She needed to stop. She needed to assess her leg. She slid down the side of the tractor, biting her lip until she tasted blood to keep from crying out. She looked at her thigh. The tourniquet was holding, but the tissue below it was turning a terrifying shade of dusky blue. She was losing her leg. If she didn't get medical evac soon, she would lose her life to the toxins building up in the dying limb. Evac isn't coming, she reminded herself. Wyatt isn't flying the chopper into a hot zone with no comms. She was on her own. She unzipped the dead Russian's dump pouch and took inventory. The magazines, the grenade, a half-eaten bar of dark chocolate wrapped in foil. Her stomach clamped at the sight of the food, but she forced herself to eat it. It tasted like ash and wax, but the sugar hit her bloodstream like a jolt of electricity. She listened. The forest was dead quiet. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, oppressive stillness. They had found the body by now. She knew exactly how it was playing out. The shock, the anger, the shift in tactics. They wouldn't be moving in loose pairs anymore. They would group up. They would move tactically, covering every angle, treating her not as a wounded animal, but as a hostile operator. She couldn't outrun them. Her leg wouldn't allow it. So, she had to make them bleed for every inch they took. Cora pulled the fragmentation grenade she had looted. It was a standard Russian RGD-5, smooth, heavy, olive drab. She looked around the logging camp. It was a perfect choke point. To bypass the deep ravines on either side, they had to move through the center of the camp, right past a narrow gap between two collapsed timber sheds. She limped over to the gap, dragging her bad leg, her breath coming in ragged, steaming puffs. Setting a trap with frozen fingers is a terrifying exercise in patience. Cora knelt in the snow, her knees screaming. She pulled a length of high-tensile fishing line from her survival kit. It was thin, practically invisible against the white and grey backdrop. She tied one end to the rusted hinge of a shed door. She stretched the line across the gap, keeping it ankle-high, just above the snow line. Now came the hard part. She wedged the grenade into a crack in the opposing shed's wooden piling. It had to be tight enough to hold, but loose enough that the pin could be pulled without dislodging the explosive. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to stop and press them against her chest to steady them. Breathe. Just breathe. If she blew herself up here, they won by default. She threaded the other end of the fishing line through the pull ring of the grenade pin. She tied it off, leaving just enough slack so it wouldn't pull prematurely. She stared at the pin. She had to bend the safety tines flat so the pin would slide out with minimal force. Using the edge of her combat knife, she painstakingly bent the thick metal wires straight. It was a crude, dirty trap. A Hollywood explosive wouldn't work out here. But a tired man, looking through a thermal scope, watching the trees for a sniper, wouldn't be looking at his ankles. Cora backed away slowly, careful not to disturb the snow more than necessary. She dragged a dead branch behind her, obscuring her immediate footprints, making it look like she had just pushed straight through the gap. She retreated to the rusted tractor, climbing painfully into the elevated cab. The glass was blown out, and the seat was torn leather and exposed springs. But it gave her a commanding view of the gap, 40 yards away. She rested the barrel of the AK-12 on the rusted windowsill of the cab. She waited. The cold sank its teeth in deep. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. The blue tint in her leg was spreading upward. She felt a wave of profound, heavy exhaustion wash over her. She closed her eyes for just a second. Snap! The sound of a dry twig breaking under a heavy boot. Cora's eyes snapped open. The lethargy vanished, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. They were here. 3 figures materialized from the tree line. They moved differently than the point man. Tighter. Weapons raised, sweeping every shadow. They were using hand signals, communicating seamlessly. One of them pointed at the ground. They had found her brushed-over trail. The lead man, carrying a heavy light machine gun, gestured toward the gap between the sheds. He signaled for the other two to push through while he provided cover. Cora held her breath. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger of her rifle. The two operators moved toward the gap. They were checking the rooftops, checking the deep shadows inside the sheds. They were looking for her. The first man stepped through the gap. His boot caught the fishing line. There was a tiny metallic tink as the pin pulled free. The operator froze. He felt the tension on his boot. He knew exactly what that sound was. "Granata!" he screamed, dropping his weapon and throwing himself backward. The RGD-5 detonated. The explosion ripped through the quiet forest like a thunderclap. The wooden piling shattered, sending lethal splinters of jagged timber outward alongside the steel shrapnel. The shockwave kicked up a massive cloud of white snow and black dirt. The man who tripped the wire caught the brunt of it. The blast threw him sideways like a rag doll, his armor unable to protect his legs and lower torso from the upward fragmentation. He hit the snow, screaming, a wet, horrifying sound of pure agony. The second man had thrown himself prone, surviving the initial blast, but he was disoriented, his ears ringing, struggling to bring his rifle up. Cora didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger of the AK-12. The suppressed weapon chattered in her hands. She put 2 rounds into the chest of the disoriented second man, then adjusted her aim and put a 3rd round through the gap in his helmet, dropping him instantly. The machine gunner in the rear immediately opened fire. He didn't know exactly where she was, but he saw the muzzle flash from the tractor cab. Heavy 7.62mm rounds chewed through the rusted metal of her cover. The glassless windows shattered further as bullets sparked off the frame, showering Cora with hot metal fragments and rust. She dropped to the floor of the cab, curling into a ball as the deafening roar of the machine gun suppressed her entirely. 2 dead, 1 wounded, 11 left, she calculated, pressing her hands over her ears. They weren't hunting a wounded animal anymore. They had just walked into a meat grinder, and Cora, bleeding, freezing, and terrified, smiled a tight, cynical smile in the darkness of the ruined cab. Let them come. Vibrations tore through the rusted floorboards of the tractor, rattling Cora's teeth together. The heavy machine gunner wasn't just shooting. He was trying to erase the vehicle from existence. Heavy 7.62 by 54mm rounds punched through the decaying steel like it was wet cardboard. Each impact sounded like a sledgehammer striking an anvil, sending lethal shards of orange rust and jagged metal ricocheting inside the cab. Cora pressed her face into the grease-stained floor, making herself as small as humanly possible. A jagged strip of shrapnel sliced across the back of her neck. She barely felt it. The sheer volume of noise was a physical weight, pressing the air out of her lungs and reducing her world to a blinding, deafening chaos. She couldn't stay here. The gunner was laying down a base of fire, pinning her in place, while the rest of the Spetsnaz squad maneuvered to flank. In less than 60 seconds, operators would be kicking in the doors of the sheds, putting crossfire into the tractor and turning her into a bloody sponge. She rolled onto her back, her breathing coming in ragged, dusty gasps. She looked up at the dashboard. It was completely obliterated, wires hanging like spilled guts. Beneath the steering column, a large, rusted-out hole gaped in the floor pan, exposing the snow and mud directly beneath the tractor's front axle. It was a tight squeeze. For a healthy person, it would be difficult. For someone with a paralyzed, dying leg and a chest rig full of stolen magazines, it was borderline impossible. She didn't have a choice. Cora slung the captured AK-12 across her back, the sling digging fiercely into her collarbone. She wriggled headfirst toward the hole. The metal edges were sharp, biting into her tactical jacket, tearing the fabric. She pushed her head and shoulders through, immediately plunging her face into a freezing puddle of diesel-scented mud. The machine gun roared on, a continuous, deafening drumbeat. Cora grabbed the greasy front axle and pulled. Pain flared in her wounded thigh, a sickening, tearing sensation that made her vision swim with black spots. She bit down on her lip until she tasted hot copper, dragging her useless leg through the jagged opening. A strip of metal caught the black nylon of her tourniquet, snagging it. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. If the tourniquet snapped, she would bleed out in minutes. She contorted her body, ignoring the heavy rounds slamming into the engine block inches above her head. She blindly reached back, her frozen fingers fumbling with the torn metal, bending it just enough to free the strap. She dropped into the mud beneath the tractor, completely hidden from the gunner's line of sight. She didn't stop. She crawled on her elbows and belly, dragging her dead weight through the freezing slush, moving toward the rear tires. 30 yards away, the gunner was changing a belt. The sudden absence of gunfire was almost as deafening as the shooting. Cora peeked around the massive, rotting rubber of the rear tire. The gunner was kneeling behind the shattered remains of a logging stump, slamming the feed tray cover of his PKM down. He was shouting something in Russian, his voice tight with adrenaline. To his left, the wounded man from the grenade blast was still screaming. It was a horrible, wet, rhythmic wailing. He was missing his left foot, the stump pumping arterial blood into the snow. Cora should have felt pity. She didn't. She felt an ugly, predatory relief. A screaming man is a distraction. A screaming man degrades the morale of his unit. She brought the AK-12 up, bracing the polymer handguard against the tractor tire. She clicked the fire selector to semi-auto. The gunner racked the charging handle of his weapon. He raised his head, looking directly at the battered tractor cab, preparing to unleash another belt. Cora placed the illuminated chevron of her optic directly over the bridge of his nose. She exhaled, pausing her breath at the bottom of the cycle. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed AK coughed. The gunner's head snapped backward as the 5.45mm round punched through his tactical goggles and exited the back of his Kevlar helmet in a spray of pink mist and shattered composite. He collapsed sideways, pulling the machine gun down with him. The screaming wounded man suddenly stopped, staring in horror at his dead comrade. Cora didn't shoot him. He was out of the fight, bleeding heavily and drawing resources. She lowered the rifle, her chest heaving, her breath pluming in the freezing air. 11 left, she thought, her mind sluggish, calculating the grim math. She pushed away from the tire, crawling backward into the dense underbrush at the edge of the logging camp. She needed to put distance between herself and the kill zone before the flanking elements converged. She hauled herself up, using the low-hanging branch of a spruce tree, her bad leg screaming in protest, the dead tissue flopping uselessly. She began to limp into the deep timber, leaving the logging camp behind. Every step was a negotiation with agony. The wind picked up again, howling through the pines, biting through her sweat-soaked layers. The adrenaline was fading, leaving nothing but an echoing, hollow exhaustion. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling violently. The fingernails were blue. She was winning the gunfight, but she was losing the war against the cold. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself with violence. It sneaks up on a person like a heavy, suffocating blanket. 2 hours had passed since the logging camp. The sky above the canopy had turned a deep, bruised purple. Night was coming, and with it, temperatures that would drop well below zero. Cora dragged herself over a ridge overlooking a frozen creek bed. The forest here was ancient. the pines growing so thick they blocked out whatever faint light remained. The snow was deeper, almost knee-high, turning every step into a monumental exertion of will. Her mind was beginning to slip. She kept seeing Walker out of the corner of her eye. He was standing behind a birch tree, holding his spotting scope, nodding at her. She knew he was dead. She knew his brains were currently freezing to the concrete of a sniper hide 5 miles away. But the hallucination was stubbornly persistent. "Wind is full value, left to right," she muttered aloud, her voice sounding raspy and foreign. "Send it." She stopped, leaning heavily against a boulder. She blinked, shaking her head. The vision of Walker dissolved into a pile of snow-covered deadfall. "Get a grip, Cora." She was losing it. She slid down the face of the rock, hitting the snow with a dull thud. Her entire body felt leaden. A strange, terrifying warmth was beginning to spread through her chest. It felt incredibly comfortable. The shivering, which had racked her frame for hours, had stopped. She knew exactly what that meant: the white room. Her core temperature was dropping to a critical level. Her body was abandoning the extremities, flooding her brain with a false sense of comfort before the lights went out for good. She slapped her own face, hard. The sting barely registered. "Wake up," she hissed, forcing herself to focus on the immediate, excruciating reality. She looked down at her right leg. The tactical pants were stiff with frozen blood. The tissue below the tourniquet was entirely numb. She had applied the windlass over 3 hours ago. Standard medical doctrine dictated that a limb could survive for roughly 2 hours without blood flow before cellular death became irreversible. She was well past that window. If she didn't loosen the tourniquet, she would lose the leg. If she loosened it, the built-up toxins, lactic acid, and potassium from the dying tissue would flood her bloodstream, potentially causing a cardiac arrest. And she would start bleeding again. It was a terrible choice: die of hypothermia and a rotting leg, or die of a heart attack in the snow. She unholstered her knife. Her fingers were so clumsy she nearly dropped it. She cut the fabric of her pants away from the wound, exposing the pale, waxy flesh. The entry hole was dark and coagulated, the edges puckered and angry. Cora took a deep breath, biting down on the leather strap of her rifle sling. She gripped the plastic windlass of the tourniquet and turned it a 1/4 inch, releasing the tension. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A wave of absolute, pure agony rushed down her leg, followed immediately by a burning sensation that felt like battery acid being injected into her veins. Her heart stuttered in her chest, hammering against her ribs with terrifying, irregular thumps. Blackness clawed at the edges of her vision. She tasted bile. She screamed around the leather strap, her body bucking against the snow. Blood immediately began to well up from the bullet hole, spilling dark and warm over her frozen skin. She held it open for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds of uninterrupted hell. Then she wrenched the windlass tight again, locking it back into place. Cora collapsed sideways, vomiting violently into the snow. Her chest heaved, her heart racing dangerously fast. She lay there for a long time, listening to the wind, waiting to see if her heart would stop. It didn't. She wiped her mouth with the back of her frozen glove. She had bought herself a little more time. The leg was still dying, but the toxic load in her blood was diluted. Crunch. Cora froze. The sound was faint, masked by the wind, but unmistakable. She forced herself into a sitting position, bringing the AK-12 up. Her vision was blurry, her eyes struggling to focus in the gathering gloom. 2 figures were moving down the ridge she had just descended. They were tracking her. They weren't moving carelessly, they were leapfrogging, One man would move, while the other covered, sweeping the trees with thermal optics. They were relentless. The Alpha group didn't quit. Cora didn't have the strength to run. She didn't have the energy to set a complex trap. She only had the geometry of the frozen creek bed. She rolled onto her stomach, crawling to the edge of the embankment. The drop to the creek was about 10 feet, ending in a jumble of jagged, ice-covered rocks. She slid over the edge, her bad leg trailing uselessly, and tucked herself into a hollow beneath an overhang of frozen roots. She was completely concealed from above, but if they came down into the creek, she would be trapped like a rat. She watched through the tangle of roots as the two operators approached the edge of the embankment. They were moving agonizingly slow. The point man stopped exactly where Cora had been vomiting. He knelt, examining the fresh blood and bile in the snow. He keyed his radio, speaking in hushed tones. The second man stood over him, his rifle scanning the opposite bank. Cora leveled her rifle. The angle was awful. She had to shoot upward, through the roots. If she missed, she was dead. She aimed for the standing man, the center of mass. She pulled the trigger. The AK-suppressed burst tore through the roots, sending chunks of frozen wood flying. The standing operator took 2 rounds directly to the chest. The ceramic plate stopped the penetration, but the blunt force trauma at that range was like taking a baseball bat to the sternum. He staggered backward, gasping, dropping to one knee. The point man reacted instantly. He didn't look for her. He simply pointed his rifle at the roots below him and held down the trigger. A barrage of 5.45mm rounds shredded the overhang. Dirt, snow, and splinters rained down on Cora. One of the rounds caught her. It felt like getting kicked by a mule. The bullet struck the heavy ceramic plate covering her right lung. The impact threw her violently against the icy rocks behind her. The breath was driven from her body in a wet, ragged gasp. She felt a rib crack, a sharp, stabbing pain that made her eyes water. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs refused to expand. The point man stopped firing and peered over the edge of the embankment, his pistol drawn, ready to finish the job. Cora didn't try to aim her rifle. She didn't have the breath or the strength. Instead, she drew her SIG P2-26 sidearm from its holster, pointed it upward, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The loud, unsuppressed cracks of the 9mm echoed off the creek walls. The first 2 rounds missed entirely, sparking off the rocks. The third caught the Russian directly under the chin. He pitched forward, tumbling over the edge of the embankment. His heavy armored body crashed through the roots, landing face first on the icy rocks mere inches from Cora's boots. His neck snapped with a wet crunch. Above, the man who had taken the rounds to the plate was recovering. He was wheezing, struggling to bring his weapon to bear. Cora forced her paralyzed lungs to draw a breath. It felt like inhaling ground glass. She raised the pistol, bracing her shaking wrist with her free hand, and fired twice more. The operator slumped forward into the snow, silent. Cora dropped her head back against the ice, her pistol falling from her numb fingers. 9 left. The night had fully arrived, and she was bleeding, broken, and trapped in a hole. Darkness in the wilderness is not empty. It is a heavy, living thing that presses against the eyes. The temperature plummeted to -18 degrees. The air was so cold, it burned the nasal passages, turning every inhalation into a chore. Cora dragged herself out of the creek bed an hour later. Her body was shutting down. The cracked rib made every movement a localized torture session. Her chest plate was compromised. The ceramic shattered beneath the nylon cover. The tourniquet was biting into her flesh with a sadistic persistence. She found shelter in the root system of a massive, overturned spruce. It formed a shallow, claustrophobic cave of dirt and tangled wood, barely large enough for her to curl into. It smelled of deep earth, frozen rot, and her own drying blood. She huddled in the utter blackness, shivering uncontrollably now. The white room had vanished, replaced by the brutal, shivering reality of advanced hypothermia. Her teeth chattered so hard she thought they might chip. The Spetsnaz commander had changed his tactics. Cora knew this because she heard the deep, rhythmic thumping of a heavy transport drone miles away, dropping flares. Suddenly, the forest canopy was illuminated by a sickly, blood-red glow. The parachute flare drifted slowly downward, casting long, writhing shadows through the trees. The world turned into a nightmare landscape of stark crimson and pitch black. They weren't tracking her anymore. They were sweeping. They had formed a skirmish line. 9 men, spaced out over 200 yards, walking forward like beaters on a hunt. They were destroying everything in their path, firing into deadfalls, tossing grenades into ravines. They were done playing games. They were going to sterilize the forest. Cora gripped the cold polymer of her AK-12. She had 1 full magazine left, plus a handful of rounds in the pistol. The red light flickered and danced across the dirt walls of her hide hole. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the crusted snow. They were close. The sweeping line was passing directly over her position. She held her breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in her ribs. A pair of white camouflaged boots appeared at the edge of the overturned root system, illuminated by the dying red flare. The operator stopped. He was standing directly above her hollow. Dirt crumbled from the ceiling, dusting her face. She could hear his breathing through his balaclava. Slow, methodical, he clicked a high-lumen tactical flashlight onto the barrel of his rifle. A blinding beam of white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping the interior of the root cave. Cora pressed herself flat against the back wall, burying her face in the freezing dirt, closing her eyes tight so the whites wouldn't reflect the light. The beam washed over her boots. It lingered on the dragging, bloody trail she had left, leading into the hole. He knew she was in there. He didn't stick his head in. He wasn't stupid. He unclipped a fragmentation grenade from his belt. Cora heard the distinct metallic ping of the spoon flying off. He was going to drop it into the hole and walk away. Adrenaline, pure and unadulterated by exhaustion, flooded Cora's system. It was the frantic energy of a cornered animal realizing it had 0 options left. She didn't try to shoot him. She didn't try to run. As the Russian dropped the grenade, Cora lunged forward, throwing her entire body weight toward the entrance. She caught the heavy, olive-drab explosive like a baseball, her numb fingers wrapping around the cold steel. She didn't throw it back. There was no time. The fuse was 3 seconds. She shoved it violently into the deep, muddy recess of a thick root cluster, throwing her body in the opposite direction and curling into a tight fetal position, clamping her hands over her ears. The explosion was a deafening, concussive roar in the confined space. The dirt cave collapsed. Heavy clods of frozen earth, splintered wood, and rocks rained down, burying Cora in a suffocating avalanche of debris. The shockwave rattled her brain in her skull, blowing out her left eardrum in a high-pitched whine of sudden deafness. Above, the operator had been thrown off his feet by the blast erupting beneath him. The root system splintered upward, knocking him flat onto his back in the snow. Cora clawed her way out of the collapsed dirt. She couldn't hear anything out of her left ear. She couldn't feel her legs. She was operating purely on the reptilian brain stem. She burst from the ruins of the root system like a corpse rising from a grave. Covered in black mud, blood and snow, She looked less human and more like a feral spirit of the forest. The Russian operator was sitting up, shaking his head, his rifle lying a few feet away. He saw her emerge in the dim, fading light of the flare. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He reached for his sidearm. Cora didn't use her gun. It was clogged with dirt from the blast. She tackled him. Her momentum carried them both backward, sliding down a steep, snow-covered embankment. They tumbled together, a tangle of limbs, armor, and desperate violence, crashing through thorny bushes and dead branches. They hit the bottom of the embankment, splashing into a shallow, freezing runoff stream. The water was waist-deep, choked with chunks of broken ice. The cold was shocking, stealing the last dregs of air from Cora's lungs. The Russian was bigger, stronger, and relatively unhurt. He scrambled to his knees in the freezing water, throwing a brutal punch that caught Cora in the jaw. Her head snapped back, stars exploding in her vision. She tasted blood, thick and metallic. He lunged for her throat, driving her backward into the water. His heavy hands wrapped around her windpipe, pressing her under. The freezing stream rushed over her face. The cold was agonizing. Water rushed into her nose and mouth. She thrashed, her hands clawing at his wrists, her fingernails tearing strips of flesh from his forearms, but his grip was iron. He was drowning her. Her vision began to grey out. Her lungs screamed for oxygen. The thrashing of her limbs grew weaker. This was it, the cynical voice whispered. She had fought hard, but the math had finally caught up. No. She went limp. She stopped fighting his grip. The Russian, feeling her resistance fade, leaned his weight forward, pressing her deeper into the icy mud, confident the fight was over. As his weight shifted forward, Cora brought her right hand up from beneath the water. She still had her combat knife, tethered to her wrist by a lanyard. She didn't aim for the armor. She didn't aim for the throat. She drove the blade with every ounce of remaining strength straight into the unprotected gap beneath his armpit, angling the knife upward toward the heart. The blade sank to the hilt. The Russian stiffened violently. The pressure on her throat vanished instantly. He let out a wet, gargling gasp, his eyes bulging. He grabbed her shoulder, not to drown her, but to hold himself up. Cora twisted the blade sharply and ripped it free. Hot blood pulsed into the freezing water, turning the stream black in the dim light. The operator collapsed sideways, thrashing in the water for a few seconds before going completely still, his body floating against a chunk of ice. Cora broke the surface, gasping violently, spitting out bloody water. She dragged herself onto the icy bank, her body shivering so hard she couldn't stand. 8 left. The flare died overhead, plunging the forest back into absolute, suffocating darkness. Cora lay in the mud, staring up at the invisible sky. She was soaking wet, freezing, deaf in one ear, and bleeding. But she was alive, and the dark belonged to her now. Water in sub-zero temperatures is a death sentence. It bypasses the skin and attacks the organs directly, pulling heat from the core at a rate 20 times faster than freezing air. Cora dragged herself onto the rocky bank, her teeth clicking together so violently she tasted chipped enamel. Her tactical jacket, soaked in stream water and blood, was freezing solid, turning into a stiff, icy shell that restricted her movement. Her left leg was a dead, heavy log dragging through the silt. She had minutes before irreversible hypothermic shock shut down her heart. She looked back at the dead operator floating against the ice. He was dry underneath his plate carrier. Survival strips away dignity. It reduces humans to ugly, practical animals. Cora crawled back to the edge of the water, grabbed the dead man by his load-bearing harness, and hauled him halfway onto the bank. Her fingers were entirely numb, reduced to clumsy, uncooperative meat hooks. She fumbled with the heavy buckles of his chest rig, ripping it away. She unzipped his Gore-Tex winter shell. Beneath it, he wore a thick, dry fleece and thermal base layers. Taking off her own wet gear was an exercise in pure agony. The torn fabric of her pants had frozen to the raw meat of her wounded thigh. When she peeled it back, she didn't just rip fabric, she tore away coagulated blood and flesh. She bit deeply into the meat of her own forearm to muffle the scream, warm blood filling her mouth. She stripped to her underwear in the freezing wind, her skin immediately turning a mottled, terrifying blue. She dragged the dead man's fleece over her head. It was massive on her, smelling aggressively of stale sweat and gunpowder, but the trapped body heat still clinging to the fabric felt like a miracle. She pulled on his dry, tactical pants over her wounded leg, cinching the belt tight around her waist. She reapplied her tourniquet over the dry fabric, cranking the windlass until the familiar, blinding pain returned, ensuring she wouldn't bleed out. She scavenged his gear, 3 magazines for the AK, a fresh medical kit, and, clipped to his helmet, a set of dual-tube panoramic night vision goggles. Cora wiped the blood off the lenses and pulled the harness over her head. She flipped the tubes down and hit the power button. The forest snapped from pitch black into a crisp, glowing world of green and white phosphorus. Every branch, every snowflake, every drop of blood stood out with terrifying clarity. She wasn't blind anymore. The playing field wasn't just leveled, it had tilted violently in her favor. She racked the bolt of her AK-12, the metallic snap sharp and reassuring. She had 8 targets left. They were spread out, cold, and looking for a ghost in the dark. Cora moved away from the stream, her dry clothes insulating her core, the shivering subsiding into a dull, manageable tremor. The NVGs gave her a massive advantage, but they also destroyed her depth perception. She stumbled over a hidden root, falling hard onto her cracked rib. The pain was a sharp spike of white-hot iron, but she swallowed the groan, rolling into a kneeling position. Through the green glow, she saw them. 300 yards up the ridge, moving in a tight file. 3 operators. They were clustered together, a fatal mistake bred by fear. The psychological toll of finding their squad mates slaughtered in the dark was breaking their discipline. They were sweeping their white lights frantically across the tree line, broadcasting their exact position. Cora rested the barrel of her rifle in the crook of a birch branch. The distance was far for an unmagnified optic in the dark, but they were backlit by their own flashlights. She aimed at the center man. He was arguing with the point man, his hands gesticulating wildly, his rifle pointed at the ground. Breathe in, exhale, squeeze. The suppressed rifle coughed. The center man crumpled instantly, the 5.45mm round snapping his spine at the base of the neck. He didn't cry out. He just folded into the snow like a dropped puppet. The other 2 reacted with panicked, ill-disciplined violence. They didn't seek cover. They simply raised their weapons and dumped entire magazines into the darkness, firing blindly at the muzzle flash they couldn't accurately pinpoint. Tracers zipped through the canopy high above Cora, shredding pine needles and sending showers of sparks raining down. Cora didn't flinch. She adjusted her aim to the right, finding the point man illuminated by his own muzzle flash. She fired twice. Both rounds caught him in the unprotected pelvic girdle below his armor plate. He screamed, dropping his rifle and falling backward, clutching his shattered hips. The last man stopped firing. The silence roared back into the forest, broken only by the screaming of the wounded man in the snow. The survivor panicked. He turned and ran. He didn't tactically retreat. He broke into a dead, terrified sprint up the ridge, abandoning his dying comrade. Cora tracked him through the NVGs, watching his heat signature glow bright green. She led him by 2 feet, waiting for him to pass a gap between 2 thick oaks. As he crossed the gap, she pulled the trigger. The round took him behind the ear. His forward momentum carried his limp body face first into the trunk of a tree. He bounced off the bark and lay perfectly still. 5 left. Cora lowered the rifle. Her chest heaved. The acrid smell of burnt powder hung in the stagnant air. She listened to the wounded man up the ridge. He was begging for help in Russian, his voice wet and pathetic. She left him to the cold, let his screams demoralize the remaining 4. She slipped backward into the heavy timber, becoming nothing more than a shadow moving through the green phosphor world. Fear has a distinct smell. It's a sour, metallic odor that seeps through pores and ruins discipline. The remaining 5 men, led by a seasoned commander, had grouped up near the crest of a rocky defile. Cora watched them from an elevated outcropping 50 yards away, her body pressed flat against the freezing granite. They had found the man Cora had shot in the pelvis. He had bled out minutes before they arrived. Through her optics, Cora watched the commander. He was physically imposing, wearing heavy communications gear on his back. He was violently grabbing his men by their plate carriers, shoving them into a defensive perimeter. He was trying to hold them together, barking orders that Cora couldn't hear but completely understood. Form up. Check the sectors. Do not break. They knew they were being hunted. The predator had become the prey, and the psychological whiplash was tearing them apart. Cora checked her magazine. 7 rounds left. She had 2 spare magazines in the rig, but changing them with hands this numb was a risk. She needed them moving. A static defense was hard to crack. She needed them clustered in the defile, where the jagged rocks would funnel them into a kill zone. She pulled the last fragmentation grenade from her rig. Her left arm was practically useless, the shoulder stiff and screaming from the fall in the creek. She used her teeth to pull the pin, spitting the metal ring into the snow. She didn't throw it at them. She threw it high into the canopy above their heads. The grenade detonated in the thick branches of a dead pine. The explosion sent a lethal shower of shrapnel and jagged timber raining down on the Spetsnaz perimeter. It wasn't a direct hit, but the concussive blast echoing off the rocks and the terrifying rain of debris shattered their fragile discipline. One of the operators broke. He screamed, abandoning his position and sprinting headlong into the narrow, rocky defile, desperate for the illusion of cover the high walls provided. "Niet!" the commander roared, reaching for him, but it was too late. The panic was contagious. 2 others broke formation, chasing the first man into the fatal funnel of the ravine. The commander and his radio man were left exposed on the crest. Cora didn't bother with the running men. The defile was a dead end, choked with deep snow. They had just taken themselves out of the fight temporarily. She focused on the commander. He was bringing his weapon up, scanning the ridge where the grenade had been thrown from. He was good. He hadn't panicked. Cora centered the green chevron of her optic on his radio man's chest. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle clicked. A jam. A frozen, dirty cartridge had failed to feed, locking the bolt halfway open. The metallic clack was faint, but in the dead silence following the explosion, it was loud enough. The commander snapped his rifle toward Cora's outcropping. Before Cora could clear the malfunction, heavy 5.45mm rounds hammered the granite inches from her face. Rock chips exploded outward, slicing into her cheek. She rolled backward, sliding down the icy backside of the outcropping, losing her NVGs in the scramble. The world plunged back into absolute, terrifying darkness. She landed hard in a snowdrift, her bad leg twisting agonizingly beneath her. The breath left her lungs in a sharp gasp. "She is here!" The commander's voice boomed in heavy, accented English, echoing off the rocks. He wanted her to know he was coming. Cora desperately racked the charging handle of the AK-12, kicking the frozen casing clear. The bolt slammed home. The weapon was hot. She heard boots crunching on the snow above her. He was moving fast, abandoning caution for aggression. She couldn't stay in the drift. She hauled herself up, leaning heavily against the rough bark of a pine tree. Her vision swam in the darkness, purple blotches dancing across her retinas. The radio man appeared on the lip of the outcropping above her, his silhouette blocking out the faint ambient starlight. He aimed his rifle downward. Cora didn't aim. She pointed the barrel upward and held the trigger down, dumping the remaining 6 rounds of her magazine in a wide arc. The radio man absorbed 3 rounds to the torso. He toppled forward, falling 10 feet and crashing heavily into the snowdrift Cora had just vacated. Empty. The bolt locked back. Cora dropped the rifle. She drew her pistol. 4 rounds left in the magazine. "You are dead, American," the commander's voice came from the darkness, no longer shouting, but a low, dangerous rumble. He was close, less than 20 feet away. He had flanked her while the radio man took the direct route. Cora pressed her back against the pine tree, ignoring the sticky warmth of fresh blood running down her neck from the rock chips. She gripped the pistol with both hands, her thumbs overlapping, her breathing shallow and silent. "Your men are dead," Cora rasped. Her voice sounded demonic, dry, cracked, and completely devoid of emotion. "You're dying in a swamp for nothing." A heavy silence followed. Then the crunch of snow to her left. She spun, firing twice blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes illuminated the massive frame of the commander. He was mid-stride, his rifle raised. Both of Cora's 9mm rounds sparked harmlessly off his heavy chest plate. He fired a controlled burst. 2 rounds ripped through the fleshy part of Cora's left shoulder, missing the bone but tearing muscle and tendon to shreds. The kinetic impact spun her around like a top, slamming her face first into the dirt. The pistol flew from her grip, disappearing into the deep snow. She was unarmed. She was shot. She was bleeding out. The heavy crunch of boots closed the distance. The commander stood over her, his flashlight clicking on, blinding her with a brilliant white beam. He didn't shoot her immediately. He looked down at the broken, bleeding, freezing woman who had systematically dismantled his elite team. His breathing was heavy, steam pluming from his balaclava. "You fight like a rat," he spat, leveling his rifle at her head. Cora looked up into the blinding light. Her left arm was dead. Her right leg was dead. She was drowning in her own blood. But her right hand was resting on the chest rig of the dead radio man who had fallen next to her. Her frozen fingers slipped past the nylon pouches, finding the smooth, heavy shape of his combat knife. "Squeak," Cora whispered. She rolled violently toward him, ripping the knife from its sheath. She didn't lunge up. She drove the blade horizontally across the back of his knee, severing the hamstrings and the popliteal artery in one brutal, sawing motion. The commander roared in shock and agony, his leg collapsing instantly beneath him. He crashed down beside her, his rifle firing wildly into the dirt. The attrition was over. Only the butchery remained. There is no glory in close-quarters combat. It is not a choreographed dance of martial prowess. It is a desperate, pathetic struggle for oxygen and leverage. The commander hit the ground hard, his heavy gear weighing him down in the deep snow. Cora didn't hesitate. She scrambled on top of him, dragging her useless leg, acting on pure adrenaline-fueled instinct. He backhanded her across the face with his heavily gloved hand. The blow shattered Cora's nose, sending a geyser of hot blood down her throat. Her vision flashed white, but she didn't let go. She drove her forehead directly into the bridge of his nose, the sickening crunch of cartilage echoing in the small space. He grunted, dropping his rifle to get both hands on her. His thick fingers locked around her throat, squeezing with the desperate strength of a man watching his life bleed out into the snow from his severed leg. Cora gagged, her windpipe collapsing under the pressure. She stabbed wildly with the knife, but the blade skittered uselessly off his ceramic plates and thick winter gear. She was suffocating. The blackness was closing in, tight and suffocating. She dropped the knife. It was useless here. She reached up, driving her thumbs directly into his eye sockets. It was a hideous, barbaric act. The commander shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute horror, his grip instantly loosening on her throat as his hands flew up to protect his face. Cora ripped herself free, gasping for air, choking on her own blood. She grabbed the heavy, steel-cased radio pack strapped to his chest rig. Using her entire body weight, she yanked it violently upward, driving the hard metal edge directly into his exposed throat. The cartilage of his larynx crushed under the impact. He spasmed violently, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream. He thrashed in the snow, his hands clawing at his ruined throat, his severed leg pumping dark arterial blood into the white powder. Cora rolled off him, crawling a few feet away, collapsing onto her back. She lay there, staring up at the canopy. The silence returned, deeper and heavier than before. She listened to the sounds of the commander dying, the wet, rattling gasps, the frantic thrashing that slowly faded into weak twitches. And finally, the long, slow exhalation of his last breath. It was over. 15 men. Cora didn't feel victorious. She felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. The adrenaline drained from her system completely, leaving her paralyzed by a pain so absolute it felt like it existed outside of her body. Her nose was broken, her shoulder was torn, her leg was dying. She was freezing. "Wyatt," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. She dragged herself back to the commander's body. Her hands shook so badly she could barely manipulate the buckles of his radio harness. She keyed the handset, clicking the transmission button to the emergency frequency. "Actual, this is Echo 2, she wheezed into the mic. Blood bubbled on her lips. "Blind, broken, 15 down, need dust off." Static hissed back at her. She dropped the handset into the snow. She crawled over to the trunk of the pine tree, leaning her back against the rough bark. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, trying to preserve whatever microscopic amount of heat remained in her core. The 3 men who had run into the defile were still out there. Let them run. Let them freeze. They wouldn't come back. Cora closed her eyes. The White Room was returning, opening its doors, inviting her in to rest. It was so incredibly tempting. Just let go. Just sleep. High above, miles away, the faint, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades echoed through the clouds. She didn't open her eyes. She just sat in the dark, surrounded by corpses, and waited for the dawn. If this gritty, grounded descent into survival keeps audiences on the edge of their seats, viewers are encouraged to hit the like button to let the algorithm know. Crafting stories that strip away the Hollywood gloss and focus on the brutal, sensory reality of combat takes massive effort, and viewer support keeps the stories flowing. Audiences should share this video with those who appreciate intense, tactical storytelling, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss the next deep dive into the trenches. Viewers are reminded to stay sharp and stay frosty until the next installment.